So this video is about the book The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe. I just finished reading this book. I found it extremely interesting. I was introduced to this book because of its association with Steve Bannon. And we know anything associated with Steve Bannon, the media is gonna sensationalize it. I didn't find this book to be particularly political one way or the other, but I found it mind-blowingly accurate for basically the era we are in now. And this book was written in 1994. So the basic premise is that Anglo-American history goes in cycles. These cycles are called turnings, and there are 4 of them. These cycles correspond to the generation that is in power in basically midlife during this time period. The generations are given titles, these that kind of describe how they act when they have influence and power. Those titles are the artist, prophet, nomad, and hero. So basically, if we go back to the post-World War II era, that was the beginning of that was the first turning for this 4 turning cycle described by the authors. The first turning is following some kind of crisis that redefines kind of the direction and identity of the society. The last crisis was the Great Depression and culminating in World War II. And that was 80 years ago. 80 years before that was approximately the Civil War era. 80 years prior to that was the American Revolution. So you can see that these are pretty grounded in historical fact. At each point, the nation thought, oh no, this is the end. Things are unraveling. And they did unravel. Actually, the third turning is called the unraveling. But they're put back together again. So basically, the author's thesis is that during the era this book was written, the 90s, that was the kind of beginning of the unraveling. The unraveling went on until about the financial crisis. That was a kind of crisis event that took us into the 4th turning. Now, as we can see now, any observer of the U.S. government may come to the conclusion that the situation is hopeless. We're basically divided along race, divided along class, but in a weird way, where kind of the upper class won't admit to being rich and having their own interests. That's an odd thing. But out of this chaos, it will spark a crisis that will cause people to act, draw lines, and rebuild new institutions. These could include new borders. After the last 4th turning, we got the UN. We got international bodies such as, the IMF. This turning is likely going to be different. This is maybe a turning away from internationalism and obviously more towards nationalism. That seems to be the way we're going. And really just what I found remarkable was the way that the authors they seem to nail the uh, the characteristics that define each generation, and how each generation's kind of strengths and weaknesses correspond to the next generations. For instance, the World War II generation GIs gave birth to the baby boomers, and where the GIs were kind of a conformist and very civic-minded generation, the baby boomers wanted to kind of tear down the status quo, express themselves, find their inner selves. And then the baby boomers are now giving birth to the Gen Xers and millennials. And I think you can see in the millennials, there's kind of a conformity there as well. But it could be channeled in a positive way to kind of rebuild consensus and form a new identity. Or it could go an ugly way too, into some kind of, we see that too, maybe some kind of, oppressive left wing kind of almost authoritarian thing. Let's hope not. But I think if you are Gen X, which is what I am, this book, it puts you in an odd place, and that is that during the fourth turning, the crisis event, you'll be in midlife, and you may be responsible for how this crisis goes. You'll be the leaders, perhaps the cool heads. And you have to restrain your baby boomer parents, which I see. There's a fanaticism to the baby boomers that can be toxic just when it goes too far. Their anti-racism fervor was probably a good thing in the 60s, even though probably most of them were too cowardly to really do much in the 60s. But now that it's safe, we'll look out. But I think that battle has been fought. I mean, we don't need to keep fighting the same battles, and that's kind of the job of the Gen Xers, is to try to move the baby boomers off the stage a bit and make way for something new. I think we don't know what that something new is yet, but we will. And in that sense, I found this book to be somewhat of a hopeful book. It can be quite depressing to think, given kind of the historical cycles laid out, we are likely due for some kind of upheaval, crisis, and that feeling is definitely in the air in 2018. But after that will come something new, and there will be unity again, one way or the other. Don't get too down. But yes, this is a great book. I thought extremely interesting, and would highly recommend it. All right, thanks. Bye.